Okay. I think we're good there. So, all right. Well, Kyle Idleman, welcome to the Homilist podcast.
Hi, man. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this is really cool. I don't know if you know this or not, but your assistant and I, we've become friends since last December.
Yeah. Well, I have watched your podcast some, and so I wanted to be on it. And it's been a crazy season here, so I'm glad we got this worked out.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I'm glad we could get together. So that's cool. So you are in Louisville, Kentucky,
Mm-hmm.
Southeast Christian Church. It's got a wonderful reputation in inside the Christian church. Done a lot of good, a whole lot of good. It's spread, it's grown. What's the very best thing about Southeast Christian Church? What's the very best thing about it?
Well, you kind of touched on it. There's a long legacy of what I would consider to be very humble and faithful ministry, and it is something I'm thankful for every day. I sometimes say it is a lot of fun to gather harvest where you didn't work the field, and I feel that I often get to do that. I get to harvest where other people have spent a long time planting and watering, and we're still planting and watering, but there's a lot of harvest that comes in because of long time, faithful, humble service.
Yeah. Well, I want to dive into this topic a little bit deeper on the idea of kind of your preaching style. Like when I listen to you preach, what you extend is a real heart for those who are broken in a busted place. I want to dive into that more, but the question I want to ask about that is what's the inspiration behind that? And I understand, well, it's Jesus, but I mean, what's that seems to be a hard, that's your hard focus, it seems, like when I hear you preach.
Yeah, I think it probably depends what message you're listening to or what series we're in. We try pretty hard to have a intentional balance of more prophetic and vision preaching, but to also make sure that you're always preaching to the broken. I'm very aware of how many people we have on a weekend who they come and they are in they need triage. Things are a mess. And I think after hearing enough of those stories and spending enough time with those people, you never want to have a weekend where you didn't have something to say to them. I'm just increasingly convinced that there's just a lot higher percentage in our audience that really need that kind of care and shepherding. So I think just spending time with people, understanding that you're preaching to people who are broken and are going through things that are very overwhelming to them in that moment. You talk to a lot of people who grew up in churches where they went at a time in life where they were broken and desperate, and the church didn't really have anything for them. And that breaks my heart when I hear those stories. So I think understanding who your audience is and the brokenness. I love seeing the Spirit move in our church through what I would call more raw stories. It's one of my favorite things that I've seen God do in the last number of years is people are much more vulnerable about what they're going through, and that culture of vulnerability allows there to be a more genuine confession and transformation, makes more room for Jesus. And if you look at Jesus' statement of why he came to preach, he came for the broken, and he came to heal and forgive. And so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely intentional. I think it just is mostly reflective of names and faces that I have in my head as a pastor.
Yeah. Is there some connection? I mean, to your own history, to your own journey in faith and life that has brought that a little more close to home for you, in a sense of, man, I remember this deep dark moment, this season that was just tough for me, and man, I don't want people being in that spot. Like um, I want to
Sure.
reach out.
Yeah. So I've had a couple of seasons like that. So I would trace some of that back to, I remember as a 16-year-old sitting in church, and a girl that I went to school with came in and sat down in the sanctuary, and there were some people in front of me that were talking about this girl that I went to school with, who was in high school. She was pregnant, and they were concerned. I overheard some of their conversation about being concerned that she's in the youth group, and then I started listening to the sermon through her perspective of this, pregnant junior in high school girl. And I remember that for me as a 16-year-old, being I was angry. I felt angry that was her experience when she came to church. That's how people looked at her, and that's, this is how the sermon was heard by her. And I think those types of moments are significant. Then I would also say being a church planter in California really helped prepare me for preaching in Kentucky, because I learned in California, just in a place where people were more open about some brokenness. They weren't trying necessarily to keep up appearances, and also being in a new church, you have more of that. I learned that that's who they are, and that doesn't change whether you're in California or Kentucky. And so learning in a new church environment to preach to the hearts of people that way, I think it informed my preaching significantly in Kentucky.
Oh, that's good. Did you notice a difference? Did you notice the difference between the level of transparency between people in California and people in Kentucky?
Yeah, broadly, yes, but you get people in a room, and if you can get someone to be transparent and vulnerable, everyone else kind of lets their guard down some, and vulnerability is contagious. So it in the large sense, people were more guarded in Kentucky, but once you get people in a smaller group, you find out that we're all pretty much alike.
Yeah. The way we always refer to it is it's kind of like when one kid throws up on the bus. It's not going to be the only one.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah,
It's coming.
Yeah, it is. It's not the end of the show. It's not the end. Yeah. So who are some of the guys that inspire you? I mean, and let me first make this statement. And this isn't I'm not asking you to engage in this part, but let me make this statement. You are definitely a shift. You are definitely a shift in the voice as far as Southeast goes, in the way you preach. There's a definite shift, and I think it's a great one. I think it's a great one. Who are some of the guys that have inspired you and kind of brought you along? Go ahead.
Say, one of the things that Southeast has done well is that they have been intentional with that. I can tell you, when I came here to preach, one of the first things Bob Russell did was say, hey, the church doesn't need another Bob Russell. The church doesn't need another Dave Stone. We've got those. So you be you. And one of my favorite definitions of preaching, I forget who said it, but it's God's truth through personality. And I think there's a lot of power when you preach as yourself. Like your most effective sermons are going to be the God's truth through you, through your personality, what He's done in you and through you, and who He's made you to be. My most impactful sermons are not going to be me trying to emulate, someone that I happen to find super inspiring as a preacher, but it's me being me. And so they, as a church, Southeast really honored that. And you don't always see that. Sometimes when there's multiple voices within the church, a preacher will tend to gravitate to someone who preaches like themselves. It's just human nature, nothing wrong with it. We just tend to value, who we are and how we communicate, how we see the world, and the way we communicate, we tend to think is the best way to communicate. And so to understand that the humility of being able to say, hey, we don't need somebody else like me. We need a different voice. And by the way, it's so much healthier for the church because people don't compare apples to oranges. They compare apples to apples. And so, having multiple voices, that different personalities, different approaches to the text, different generations, and knowing that was welcomed, that was the desire. I think that was really important.
Yeah. I'm on staff with Luke Bycroft, and his teaching is so incredible because he's just so analytical, and there's no detail that escapes him. I mean, he's just so good. And when you sit and you listen to him preach, it's line by line by line, like nothing's getting out of the net. Like it's the whole batch, and we'll throw out the bad later, but this is the whole bit. I mean, it is just line by line. And when he preaches, there's a really cool response. Excuse me. There's a really cool response in the congregation. There's so many people who show up and they're like, "Oh my goodness. Like he impacted me on such a intellectual level, And I have a different response when I preach. When I preach, it's like that moved me to something. But for Luke, it's like that taught me, like now I understand something. And man, that's so valuable.
So an example of that for me would be, I think you had Albert Tate on recently, right?
Yeah.
So he preaches for us 4 or 5 times a year. And it's always, interesting to me how when he preaches, it awakens a part of our church that I think is so healthy that I don't awaken that. But I love and I value the fact that God uses his truth through Albert's personality and giftedness to accomplish that. I think that's a beautiful thing. So yeah, being able to, I've grown in this. I don't think I've always felt this way as a preacher, but being able to understand just the beauty of different voices, different personalities, different approaches, and how it reaches different people at different places in life. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Preachers can get pretty territorial at times.
Yeah. You would probably have better insight on. I've had such good examples of preachers who are not that way.
Yeah.
That I see it, but I've never really. I've seen the opposite with the people I work with and preach with, and so I don't have as much. I don't have as much personal experience with that, just because it's been the opposite experience for me.
Yeah, that's super. Well, what you see so many times, especially when you get into rural churches, you'll see this idea of, like, I'm the voice. Like I need to be the voice. And there, it's almost like there could be a loss of power, a loss of influence, which is really ugly. Which is a really ugly thing to see. But it becomes.
I was going to say, I suspect that will be less and less, because what was true 20 years ago is that people, I mean, that was maybe their only voice. And and so if the preacher exposed them to somebody else that was really gifted and good, then they could control that to some extent, even though that's not the right spirit. I mean, but that might have been the only person's opportunity to hear preaching, unless they were listening to maybe Chuck Swindoll at just the right time on the radio. But that was kind of it. But now, I'm amazed at the different people in our church that listen to different preachers, people that I wouldn't necessarily expect. They podcast a half a dozen preachers that I listen to, and that's a beautiful thing. And trying to control that these days, I think, is pretty impossible.
Yeah, I agree.
So it's not only spiritually immature, it's also you can't do it. So might as well embrace it.
Yeah, dumb. Yeah, it's
right.
just dumb. Yeah. Who are some of the guys that have really inspired you as far as preaching goes? And not necessarily preaching, but as far as communication goes. Who are some of those guys?
What's interesting is how that's changed for me over the years. I think I used to be really inspired by people who I considered to be, for lack of a better word, talented. Like, in the same way a singer might get inspired by someone who can just flat out sing. I used to be really inspired by preachers who can just flat out preach. And while that still is inspiring to me, what I have since in the last, I don't know, however many years, probably 5-6 years, I love to listen to like a missionary that comes in and kind of preaches out of the overflow of his heart. I love that. I have become more inspired by people who may not have, as we would call it, this hyper communication gift, but are faithfully loving God and loving people, and what they have to say comes out of the overflow of that, which is interesting. I mean, because I do love the art of preaching, but I've seen a lot of that, heard a lot of that, and I'm very grateful for it. But what inspires me tends to be, if I listen to one of our campus pastors preach, they preach 4 or 5 times a year. I love listening to their sermons, man, because I know how they love God, I know how they love people, and it's that inspires me.
Yeah, that's cool. When does your writing and your preaching sound similar?
Mine does. I think that the challenge, I'll see if I can word this right, but because I've not really expressed this much, but I think the challenge is, a lot of preachers write how they preach, and that's fine and good. A lot of times you can tell when you're reading a book where it's a collection of sermons. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. You just kind of tell. But for me, I preach how I write, if that makes sense. So I long before I started preaching sermons, I was writing sermons, and I think that the discipline of writing the sermons first, I think that helped a lot. The other thing I would say is it goes back to the embracing the personality side of it, embracing kind of who you are and the voice God has given you. I think the same thing that makes a preacher effective is the same thing that makes an author effective. That, if I can write a book and give a lot of information, and maybe it's helpful and interesting, but it's the true through personality that engages people differently. So learning to embrace your personality in both the written form and in spoken word, I think that's a big. I've not really talked much about that, but I think that's pretty important. For me, when I'm doing that, it's a lot of fun, and I sense that it flows much more naturally. If I'm neglecting that, like if I'm not intentionally kind of embracing that, it feels like a lot more work. That makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good insight. Is there some difficulty in trying to find not only your preaching voice or maybe even your writing voice or writing style, but is there some difficulty in the step that comes before that in embracing your own personality?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that, I think it requires some time to be confident in who God made you to be, and not trying to spend your time wishing you were somebody else or wishing that you had somebody else's gift, or trying to sound like someone else. My hunch is that for most people, and this was true for me, it just takes some reps, like, and that's okay too. Like, God's going to be, I'd say to young preachers, you preach as often as you can to whoever you can. There's something that happens. The more you preach, the more you kind of find your voice. I work pretty hard at not listening to the same people all the time. I'd cycle through different preachers and pastors that I listen to, just because I want to be inspired, encouraged by them. I want to be taught by them, but I don't want to be them. And I know that if I'm going to listen to, if I binge listen to preachers, which sometimes I do, then you listen to me preach the next weekend and you're like, man, yeah, it sounds a little bit like whoever this guy is he's been listening to. So I think, embracing that. And I think it takes a little bit of time to discover it and then to embrace it.
One of the joys of doing this podcast is I will have to submerge myself in the sermons of the people who are coming on as guests. And
yeah.
And so what's cool is then I will think to myself, I wonder if I can implement this certain thing that they do this next week when I preach. I wonder if I can do that.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's an undiscovered gift or ability, or maybe it's something I really can do or I'm really comfortable with. I get this opportunity of being able to, okay, so let's try to do this thing a little. No, I'm telling you, like after Albert Tate, well, I was out. I was out of gas. I don't know how in the world, to make that happen, but that's been one of the cool parts, is being able to kind of go through there. Who are some of the guys that you've spent some time listening to that have on a preaching level?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask that. I've been in this season, those last 6 months of constant preparation and writing, and this is me confessing to you that I have gotten out of the habit of regular listening, and I need to get back into it because I know it's good for my heart, and I know it challenges me. I knew you were going to ask that question, and I do think, if I can be a hypocrite, I do think it's important to be intentional to do that, to build that library. It's such an incredible time to be able to connect in that way, right? Like I think of, Bob Russell, when I came here, he had a collection of sermon tapes, that was expansive, but to really work to listen to these sermons from other people, because they're cassette tapes that you have to, we live in an incredible time to be able to learn and grow from other people's preaching, but I'm out of the habit a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I think there's seasons for that. Prior to this podcast, I was listening to nobody else, and here's the reason why. And this kind of played into the reason why I thought the podcast was just necessary. That was, I was in kind of an insecure place of what I don't want to listen to something that's great and then define me as being terrible.
Yeah.
And I don't want to listen to something that's terrible and then me say, and that's why I'm great and I don't need to move forward or grow. Like it's just that. And so it was just this, I have myself in this, this stalled out position of, man, I'm a little fearful to hear what's out there. And then it was like, buddy, you're going to have to take a step forward. You got to be a little more brave than that. You go hear some guys,
I think what you just hit on is a big part of doing this in a healthy way, is that you have an awareness of how am I listening to this person, and where is my heart and my spirit in this. And one of the things I love and appreciate about my dad, he's 73-ish, and when he lives in Louisville, Kentucky, and he's been preaching most all of his life, but it doesn't matter who is preaching, he is sitting there taking notes, listening to every word. If you ask him about the sermon, he's going to tell you 5 things about the preacher that he loved, that he's listening to it in a way that's very positive, and he wants to learn, he wants to grow, he wants to see how God is going to use the power of preaching, and he's looking for it. And I think having the right, going and listening to messages, preachers with that type of spirit, it makes a big difference.
One of the identifying marks, one of the things that I picked up in your sermons that I absolutely love, and I don't catch it in the books as much, but I do catch it in the sermons, is you have a really great sense of humor when it comes to sarcasm. And I mean that in a very positive way. Like there's a cynic deep in there somewhere, that kind of catches that kind of catches a right hook every once in a while. And I love it. I absolutely love it.
So here's one of the things I've learned the hard way, and this might be helpful for for some preachers who may have already learned this, but if you have a little sarcastic bent, you can get away with that humor a lot when the audience knows you well. So a huge advantage to preaching, at a church for a number of years is I can give a sarcastic look at the church where I preach, and I can get good humor out of that look because they know me. They know how I see things. They know what I'm thinking. They know what that means. Now, if I go to another church and I preach and I use that sarcasm looking for humor, it depends on who they're used to listening to, but it could be a significant miss. And suddenly what I thought I meant to be sarcastic comes off as, genuine. And I've created some issues. So I think, one of the beautiful things about preaching in a place where, you've invested over a number of years is that, the people know you, they know your personality. And so humor and things like that get picked up on much more easily in the home church than maybe they do on the road.
It's very good. You handle that very, very well. It's really good. And when I hear it come, I'm like, that's a good one. I'm with you. Like it's sharp enough. It's sharp enough, but nobody died, and it's really good. I appreciate it.
I love that.
I tell you, a guy I really admire his preaching, and you may have even met him or know him, Aaron Wheeler. I don't know if you remember the name or not. Aaron Wheeler. He was an Ozark grad, and I want to say he was maybe 03, 04, right around there. You were probably gone a few years by then, but
yeah.
He has that same internal cynic. He's really good with the sarcasm, but he does such a good job of pulling his heart out and putting it out there on an intellectual plane. Yeah. And that's a real gift. And I see something similar in the way you preach as well, taking your heart and putting it on an intellectual plane. Like it's kind of like, I was talking to a guy the other day, and in fact, it was Aaron. And I was telling him, I was like, the danger is sometimes in preaching is we ask a theologian to do the job of a poet, mm-hmm. And what we really need sometimes is we need somebody to step in and speak to the heart of matters. And I'm not saying we need theologians and we need teachers and we need prophets and we need the whole thing. But sometimes what you really need is what we do is we take a theologian and we say, okay, here's your job description. Now go be a poet, and yeah. It's impossible. And so in reverse, sometimes being able to take the poet and put it on an intellectual plane, that is just incredible to me. And I think you do a great job of that.
It's a great observation. I do try to do some of that intentionally, partly because, where I'm at, I know my audience is, it's eclectic. I just have a sense of the fact that I'm talking to a lot of people on both ends of that spectrum, and that's probably true everywhere to an extent. But I think some places, perhaps more so than others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's a good thing. I appreciate that. I appreciate that a whole bunch. How do you handle, or how should we handle, and if you can speak to this even personally a little bit, I'm not trying to pry, the personal breakdowns that happen for preachers in the midst of trying to lead, which I think is always so insightful when guys begin to talk about that, because it's like you're expected to be the leader. Now, how do you handle your own personal breakdown? And you seem like the kind of guy, just in your preaching, you're a pretty transparent guy on a lot of levels. So how do we do that?
So it's a great question. I think first we understand that culturally, this probably is not an option. Like, you need to be doing this to some degree, finding the healthy way to do it. But you should be intentional with that. I just think in the world we live in, being able to model some of that is so important. But that's a significant shift. Like, a lot of guys grew up, if they had a homiletics class, they may have been taught not to do that.
Right.
Like, you don't bring don't tell personal stories or illustrations in the pulpit. So, Bob Russell, who was the preacher at Southeast for so long, he was doing this long before it was, popular. He would talk about stuff in marriage and challenges and good things and bad things. And I'm really thankful that was modeled, kind of gave permission for me to do that, for Dave to do that. And a couple thoughts would be, number one, my wife is really comfortable with most of that. Like she has very little patience for pretense within the church, and it feels like one of the most important things that I need to be doing as a pastor and preacher is making sure that the rest of the church understands that we are all figuring this out, and we all have struggles and challenges, and she's taught me a ton about grace, and the way that grace is taught to people is by the only way people really catch grace is if they can see that in my life and in my marriage. And so I think that's important. I have 4 kids. 3 of my kids are out of the house, so I've had 3 teenagers while I've been preaching. I not ever use a personal struggle that was directly connected to them. I think if they were going through something and they reach a point in their lives where they want me to share some of that, then that's one thing. I mean, but it's their story to tell, and it's their testimony to share. And I never would want to tell a story about something a struggle we were having with one of them, or that they were having spiritually, that would cause there to be any kind of resentment or bitterness or hard-heartedness. And so I'm pretty protective of that. So if you hear me preach, I might talk about I'll talk about my struggles, and I'll talk about where I'm having a difficult time, or where I've really needed God's grace, or where I felt weak, where I felt overwhelmed. I'll talk about that. I rarely would talk about that. In fact, I don't think I would ever do that about someone else in my family, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. How do you wrestle with the? And you kind of touched on it. How do you wrestle with? We're all just figuring it out. We're all still figuring this thing out. The standard is for somebody to put a standard on you and say, yeah, but you are Kyle Idleman. You're the preacher. You're supposed to have this stuff. Do you ever feel any of that pressure in where you are?
I do, but I reject it passionately. I don't tolerate. I mean, I would not tolerate that spirit or that language. I would not. That would scare me pretty quickly if I felt like that was what I was creating in people. And so if that's what people are picking up, then I'm doing it wrong. And so that would be a big red flag for me. I mean, I feel some of that pressure, but it's usually from people who are new, or it's from people who aren't really connected to the church. If people who are around me were thinking that, then I have some repenting and confessing I need to put into practice.
That's good. I appreciate that. I appreciate the language that you use to say that as well, that you would reject that you would absolutely reject that whole idea. I appreciate that a bunch. We had a moment, year or so, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. We were riding in the car, and my oldest was asking me about dating. So when can we date?
Right.
And we began to, because it was like, that just kind of happens out of the blue. It's like 1 minute, it's just, we're playing and life's good and everything's just, it's so easy. And then all of a sudden it's like, hey, so I got this question about boys. And it's like, what? And so we and I'm not kidding you. I'm sitting there trying to process this stuff while we're driving down the road. My wife's beside me. And so I just pull over on the side of the road, put my hazards on, and I turn around and I say, here's the thing. I've never had a 14-year-old girl before in my life, ever. This is my very first time. I've never, ever. This is the first time of being a dad that I've ever had to deal with like a boy issue, because I've got girls in my home. And I said, have you ever wrestled with this, to my wife? And she's saying, no. asked my daughter, is this a first thing for you? This is kind of out of the blue, right? Do you know how to be a 14-year-old girl? She's like, no, I don't. So here's the deal. We're all new. We're all new. Okay. So here's my request. Can we take this step by step and just kind of stumble through? Because here's the thing you need to know about your mom and me. We don't know what we're doing. Okay. Like, we don't know. We just don't know what we're doing. Is that okay if we take it step by step? And the smile that came across her face was like, yeah, yeah, like that. Yeah, that's okay. Like, that's 100% okay. Step by step is good,
Yeah.
It was a great conversation. I shared that one. At church not long ago, and it was, oh man, the response was, I think it relieved some of the parental pressure that
I
stacks
like
up.
that. I really like the visual of saying to a congregation, not all the time, but at certain times, you pull over, you turn around and say, can we figure this out together? I think that's a really good visual of a way to communicate at certain times.
Well, and I mean, if we're wrestling with it in our home, and our life is focused in a direction, not just on Jesus, but on church, the culture of our home is probably different than a lot of people. Man, if we're wrestling with some heavy stuff and that's weighing on us, can you imagine what other people are going through, who may be new to it, may have not had the legacy of having Christian parents and being in church their entire life and being under great preachers. And I mean, really, really gifted. I mean, you were raised in a Christian home. You've been surrounded by great preachers and great men of God for a long, long time, as have I been.
Right.
And man, if it can burden me, man, some of these folks are getting buried under it, yeah. So I think about folks like that, and like, that's tough stuff. Yeah. Do you see some of the pitfalls of preachers? Do you notice some of the things that, like, you catch on to something that they do or something they say? What's the thing you look at when you hear a preacher? What's the thing you're listening for?
I think one of the pitfalls that I know that I can fall into, some of the guys that I do life with who are senior pastors, if they're part of, especially, but maybe not, maybe this is just the way I would see it. If they're a part of a large church, it's easy to put yourself in a place where you're not spending time with people one-on-one. And when you stop doing that, you start running out of things to say that people really need to hear, and so a pitfall would be, hey, I'm going to spend the next 3 weeks in meetings, working on budget stuff, studying, putting together series, and I'm not spending time with people who are in church, who are coming to church or in the community. If I'm not doing that, then that's reflected in my sermons pretty quickly. I also know that's happening if I don't have stories to tell. It's either coming out of not having enough personal reflection, where I'm not journaling, I'm not being intentional to reflect in my own life, or it comes from not knowing what's happening in the lives of other people where I can share their stories. So, to me, those are a couple of red flags that I will watch out for. One of the things I do at church is I used to go out into the lobby area and kind of shake hands and between services and such. But now I'll typically meet with 3 or 4 people on a weekend. So if anybody calls the church and they just want to talk to me, I'll say, that's awesome. I'd love to just sit down with you for 15 or 20 minutes on whatever weekend, whatever service you come to. Let's just sit down after that. And sometimes people will say, well, no, I need 30 or 45 minutes. But you know what? Almost always they just need 15. And if I can ask some questions and listen to their story and pray for them and learn their name, that it's going to make my sermon the next week more impactful because of the 10 or 15 minutes I took with the person the week before. So there's just this very direct connection to life on life, and then what happens in preaching. And by the way, I mean, this is what the Gospels teach us. This is the ministry model of Jesus. It's the one at a time approach. I mean, just so much of the real estate of the Gospels. In fact, much more real estate in the Gospels. It's not the sermons of Jesus that were recorded. It's the one-on-one. It's the one life at a time encounters that Jesus has with people. And so, that to me, that's a significant pitfall that I have to watch out for, that I don't create these walls around me that make it difficult to spend time with the people I'm preaching to.
Yeah, I think it's easy to get insulated, and I don't think that's just a big church problem. I think that's also a small church problem. I mean, I think in a situation where you're at a large church and you can have somebody who guards the door, and you can have somebody who guards the calendar, you can have somebody who guards the phone, and you can push some of that back. I think the temptation would be to go into isolation and think that that's a super valuable thing. And I'm not suggesting that it's not. I think sometimes isolation is one of the best things that can happen for your sermon. And I think what you'll see for a lot of guys in rural places is they're so inundated with people and problems and conversations, the sermon suffers,
Fantastic observation. Yeah, it's the opposite side of it, which is can be a pitfall as well. They're spending so much time with people. That's really good. You're right. Yeah, I've been in churches where I've done that too, and I think you're right.
Yeah, it's an easy thing to do, and you kind of have some voices of, you think about the guys that you had for homiletics and expository preaching and advanced biblical preaching and all this kind of stuff, and any sort of seminary class that you take, and these guys will tell you, how many hours should you put in on your sermon, whatever that number is, probably 5 more than that. That's probably 5 more would make it even better. And so then it's like, okay, so I got to do this. So by the end of the week, it's like, so I'm running on about 127-hour week in my own head. Like, how do I fit this? How do I fit this in? And so what we do is we just kind of go hard to the left, hard to the right, hard to the left, hard to the right, all people, all sermon, all people, all sermon. And I think finding that balance is pretty difficult. But I think what you're doing, I think that's a brilliant idea. And let me ask you this. Do you find that in the 15 minutes that you spend with people, 15, 20 minutes after a service, and this is after a church service, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes before, but yes, before.
Yeah. When you spend that time with people, do you find that oftentimes what they're wanting to do is just come and tell you something? They just want to tell you something.
Want to be known, man. They want to be seen. And, one of my favorite stories from the life of Jesus is with the bleeding woman, where she reaches out, touches the cloak of Jesus, she's healed, and then she tries to hide. And there's this little phrase that Luke uses where it says that, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, like she realizes she can't go unnoticed, that Jesus, is going to look for her until she's seen. And I think that's incredibly powerful as a ministry commitment, that I'm going to make sure that people can't go unnoticed, because I think that's what that 15 minutes is about. I'm not solving any huge problems in 15 minutes, but being seen and heard and prayed for and loved. Then when I get up to preach to that same person, that 30 minutes that I spend in my sermon for them feels like I'm sitting across the table for them, because now they feel known. And yeah.
So good. I on Sunday mornings, what I try to do, and sometimes things are just so crazy it's nearly impossible to pull off. But what I try to do, and we're talking in a church of 150 people, I try to make sure I shake everybody's hand before I preach. And this is something that God laid on my heart, and it sounds so silly, but here was the impactful part for me. Like, some people just need to be touched by you. They just need you to be there, reach out, hello, good to see you, glad you're here, because that's going to open up the ears, and that's going to open up the heart, and then they can hear, because now you're a human being. You're not just this disembodied voice. You're not just this talking head that's up front, but you were somebody who, like, this person came over, and it's not like a celebrity thing, like, oh, I'm famous, but sometimes just that personal interaction just so much more important. And I'm telling you what, like, that has been so valuable for me on a personal level, on taking my preaching from a head space to a heart space, because the work of a sermon can be so much head, and you can forget the hard part. Have you, it's like this, Kyle. Have you had those moments to where you wrote an entire sermon and then later thought to yourself, I don't think I prayed about this sermon one time?
Sure. Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
moments of,
yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, it turns into a paper that, just turns into something you studied and wrote about. And I don't think that's sustainable. Like, I think if you do that very long as a preacher, you'll burn out.
Yeah.
Takes the joy out of preaching. If you're trying to be the vine instead of being the branch, it won't last. It'll just wear you out. And so, I think understanding, the spiritual connection between what I'm producing and, taking the time to pray through it and be connected. That's a game changer for me, and how much I had and how much I enjoy preaching. Took the pressure off of me. It completely changed it when I started to make sure that was the priority, that the connection, not the production, was the priority.
Yeah. I've noticed that, this is me personally, maybe you can speak into this. I've noticed that the more prepared I am in my sermon, as I've taken my sermon, the more prepared I am when I go and preach, the more I come off of my manuscript, off of my document, and the more the Spirit works. Why?
So for me, I kind of resonate with that. So I can over prepare, and I go in there. I do everything by word count. So if I go in there and I'm super prepared, but I have 4,000 words, I'm too prepared. I need to have about 2,200 to 2,500 words, and I need to leave room for extra space. And that's part of the preparation process, I guess. But for me, what really gave me more freedom in preaching was when I moved to writing my sermons on Friday. I preach on Saturday. So when I started writing my sermons on Friday and finishing them on Saturday at noon, and in some ways that seems like an unprepared thing to do. But I go into Friday, I've done my studying, I've done my praying, I know where I want to go with it. If I had to, even though I've not written anything, if I had to get up and preach it, I could preach it. It might not be very good, but I could do it. And to me, like, it's about getting all the pieces of the puzzle, and then I wait till Friday to put the puzzle together. And there's something that happens. This is just very personal for me. I'm not saying this is the way to do it, but there's something that happens for me if I put the puzzle together on Friday and Saturday morning and preach it on Saturday, that it comes out of the overflow. It feels very fresh in my mind. I used to finish my sermon by Tuesday or Wednesday, go over it, 10 times. And then I think it was a little bit more rote. It wasn't as out of the overflow. And so to me, switching those days and doing the actual writing on Friday really, really helped me prepare instead of being done earlier.
Yeah.
Not everybody's that way. That's the way I'm wired.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Hey, before we hop off of here, let me ask you this last question. Then I want to tell you something about you that I appreciate, and then we'll dive out of here and you get back to your day. There's so many guys in ministry, so many guys who have been beat up, pummeled by the church, hurting, broken, busted to pieces, and they hang into ministry for any number of reasons. What is some encouragement you can give some of these guys? And specifically, I want to focus this question towards those guys who are in the churches, to where we look at the Kyle Idlemans and we look at the Aaron Brockett's, and we look at these guys that are out there in the Albert Tates and these massive churches, and we bought into a lie a long time ago that we're mega church or bust. And that's it. Like, this is the only model. Mega church is the only model. What kind of encouragement can you give some of these guys who find themselves in that place feeling like failures?
So, for me, because I went from planting a church where there was really nobody, to being a part of a large church. To me, the one at a time approach is where it's at. Like, if I understand that my calling is to, love people one at a time, and keeping that focus, because there's a lot of things in a large church that can feel very discouraging and overwhelming, and it's just they're just different. I've been in both environments, and believe me, and I can speak for Aaron on this too. There are many days where being in a church of 200 or 300 people sounds awesome. There's just different. It's just different struggles, different challenges, but it's pretty easy, I think, in either of those types of churches to feel the way you're describing, right? So I feel increasingly. I became the senior pastor at this church about 6 months ago, and one of the things that I've learned is if I put the pressure on myself to make the church grow, it's miserable. I don't care what size the church is. If you think your job is to grow the church, that's not your job. Our job is to plant the seed and water the seed, and God's the one who makes it grow. So, to go back to your job is to be the branch. You can't produce fruit. Jesus says in John 15, verse 5, if you remain in me and I remain in you, you can bear much fruit, but apart from me, you can do nothing. So, I think understanding that dependence, embracing that it is faithfulness that we've been called to. I'll let God kind of worry about the numbers and worry about the rest, which might sound easy to say, but it really is. I mean, it really is true. Otherwise, you end up feeling insecure and discouraged, or you end up feeling arrogant and prideful. And if I was going to choose, I'd rather be insecure and discouraged than arrogant and self-righteous, right? So, learning and reminding yourself it's all God's grace, and I'm going to love people one at a time. Let him worry about the rest.
Kyle Idleman, thank you so much for that, buddy. I appreciate it. Here's something I want to tell you. You have done a great job where you are. You do a great job of handling the word. You do a great job of taking the heart and laying it out in front of people. And it makes a very big stage and a very big platform something very, very personal. And I don't know if people are going to be able to come and tell you that or not, but what you've been able to do where you are is take a very large platform and make it very, very personal. And I appreciate that so much. It's been absolutely a joy listening to your sermons, reading the stuff that you've written, and even sitting down and talking to you. So thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
And thank you, brother. I love what you're doing. Thanks for teaching me and for teaching other preachers too.
Yeah. Well, buddy, I'll let you get back to it. Thank you so much for being on the Homilist podcast.
See you, brother. Thanks.
See ya.